Good evening. Welcome, everyone. I'm delighted to be here tonight with you and to welcome you. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming out to this event sponsored by the Baker Institute and co-sponsored by Rice's Sustainability Institute. Bringing to us tonight Peter Schwartzstein. Peter's work on climate violence brings a new and badly needed framework to the discussion of climate change and helps us think about how to plan for climate change's social impacts. By bringing to our attention current examples of how climate change is exacerbating, or in some cases itself triggering, climate violence, Schwartzstein asks us to rethink about how we imagine the potential consequences of climate change. His work also challenges us as scholars. While we've invested significant effort into understanding the physical mechanisms underlying climate change, Schwartzstein asks us to consider how to take this climate predictive knowledge and use it to consider when and how we will mitigate potential climate violence. His work points out the connection between climate violence and misinformation, and climate violence and escalating inequality. His work ultimately points out to us what he calls the unhappy marriage of extreme climate stresses with mismanagement and poor governance, leaving us with the model of good governance as a climate management solution. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to introduce Peter Schwartzstein.
Thank you very much for that extremely kind introduction. Thank you very much to all of you for coming out on a beautiful evening in which I would very naturally understand that you wanted to be outside. I'm going to speak to you for, 20, 25 minutes, occasionally kind of dipping into kind of a relative lack of nuance for the sake of trying to give you as broad a picture as possible within a sort of somewhat limited amount of time. And then in the question and answer session, I'd be extremely happy to sort of try and expand and elaborate on many of these points. Equally, this is a sort of presentation that I put together, which sort of began as like 10 truths about kind of climate-related violence, and then kind of bloated into 12 and 15 or so. Ultimately, I'll see at what point your heads start to droop, and then we can kind of move into a slightly more interactive get-together. I was sort of, for most of the past decade and a bit, a writer for National Geographic, and not definitively a photographer. So these excellent display of photos are mostly by the superb photographers that I've been extremely lucky to work with over the years. Every now and then you'll see one of mine that very noticeably crops in, and they're often characterized by my kind of finger jutting into the top left corner. Now, one of the books, or perhaps the biggest takeaway that I hope people get from this book, is that we are systematically underestimating the amount of violence that climate change is already contributing to, because we are not adequately taking into account how climate acts on other drivers of instability, other contributors to violence, like corruption, like misinformation, like inequality. And I'll expand on a lot of that. Now, that's the sort of thing that someone who works in this field would say. I mean, the old line, if you have a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. But I'll try and flesh that out. Now, if you're new to this subject, would have heard a little bit about climate and conflict, it's perhaps most likely in the context of Syria. And that's because from the early days of the revolution, which in turn gave rise to the civil war in 2011, sort of 2010, 2011, there was an awful lot of chatter, some of it sort of slightly excessively navel-gazing within sort of little corners of academia, about the extent to which extreme drought contributed to the initial protests. And a lot of the coverage was so unnuanced and so sensationalized that it fueled rather a kind of fierce blowback against the very idea that climate was involved at all. But what I found over the sort of 5 or 6 reporting trips that I did to various parts of Syria from about 2013 onwards was a much more corruption-centered pathway to climate-related violence than was sort of being discussed at the time. And I'll try and kind of spell this out through the story of a particular family that I encountered in the far northeast of the country. And that's because in the years leading up to 2008, years leading up to 2010, 2011, this particular family, as with almost all Syrian agricultural families, had grown painfully used to corruption from the state. Whenever they went to agricultural offices to receive seeds and fertilizers and these other inputs that, according to the Syrian system, they were theoretically receiving for free or at heavily discounted prices, they would have to pay bribes. Whenever they had any kind of interaction with any kind of official, they almost always came off poorer and bitter and resentful at having had to shell out cash for those purposes. But then when this intense multi-year drought struck from 2008 onwards, the very fact that the state was sort of actively kicking them at their time of greatest need rather than assisting them was kind of that proverbial straw that broke the camel's back. It was like that final insult as far as many of them were concerned. And in the case of this family, the sort of father figure, the husband figure, this was a kind of resentment that he, as with plenty of his peers, was simply unwilling to contend with. And he was among the first in his part of northeastern Syria, around Hasaka, to join the protests, and a little later among the first in his area to take up arms. I also suggest, or perhaps claim, that there are increasingly few conflicts out there that don't have some kind of climate component. Now, it might be a relatively small part, it might be quite tangential, it's almost never the only part. But from the kind of macro headline-grabbing conflicts in Gaza and Ukraine and Sudan onwards, almost all of them are intimately connected with an array of climate stresses. And to back that up, I'll give you the example of what's been playing out in parts of Darfur in Sudan over the past almost 2 years, where the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, who are one of the two main protagonists of the conflict, have benefited tremendously from their access to very cheap, very subsidized oil flowing over the border from Libya, which has enabled them to kind of range their vehicles across this enormous country with a facility that they simply would not have pulled off if they didn't have this like very effective and very kind of clear supply chain. Could continue in that vein, but we'll leave that there for the moment. Now, if you are also new to this subject but have heard a little bit more about it, it is the kind of pathway from climate to violence that you have perhaps heard of is the kind of threat multiplier formulation. And it's the very idea that climate is sort of akin to kind of throwing fuel on an already smoldering fire. And that can indeed be the case in some instances. But in the 10, 11, 12 years worth of reporting and research that I've done on this topic, the pathway that most frequently cropped up in my work is the kind of way in which climate is kind of eating away in a kind of termite-like manner at the coping mechanisms that individuals, that communities, and that even nation states turn to at times of crisis. And by this, I mean the very the kind of financial savings that a lot of people have often put aside for that rainy day are quite frequently depleted when these kind of drought conditions replicate themselves year after year after year. The psychological reserves that people consciously or not turn to during periods of hardship are often eroded by constant exposure to extreme difficulty. It's the old line that kind of what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. It's obviously not true. What doesn't kill you sometimes just sort of traumatizes, radicalizes, and bitters and does anything but make you stronger. And a kind of a kind of individual through which I will sort of look to kind of reinforce that point was this guy Omar, who was a fisherman who, in the years leading up to ISIS's emergence, had kind of plied his trade fishing in the waters of the Tigris, a little to the south of Mosul, in northern Iraq. And as drought in the Tigris Valley intensified, and as pollution picked up, his haul weakened and weakened and weakened. Now, he was an extremely quiet, sensitive man who was sort of temperamentally, woefully ill-suited to any kind of military service. But when ISIS came along a little bit later, and we'll talk a fair bit about ISIS because they've been the sort of centerpiece of a lot of the work that I did over the years. When ISIS came along, he felt compelled, both for reasons of patriotism, but more particularly reasons of financial need, to join the military. And over the following 2.5 years, he participated in a number of campaigns to roll ISIS back across different parts of northern Iraq. and ultimately died in a road when his vehicle rolled over an IED soon after the liberation of Mosul. And I spent an extremely bleak day or two with him and a few colleagues soon after the city, Mosul, in the background there, was liberated, as we kind of motored back and forth along the river looking for the bodies of both ISIS fighters and ISIS victims, many of which had sort of washed up in the reeds on either side of the river. To kind of, and please forgive me if I'm kind of infantilizing in any way, but there's this kind of concept that's sort of taken root in some of the more sensationalist parts of media, or perhaps even in kind of components of conventional wisdom, that kind of where previous wars were perhaps fought over oil and other kind of fossil fuels, that kind of subsequent ones down the line will be over water. And this has sort of given rise to this sort of classic water wars narrative that hydrologists have, with extremely good reason, rather aggressively pushed back against. But, and again, this sort of feeds into a lot of the existing literature that we have, much more problematic than absolute resource scarcity, much more problematic than an absolute shortage of water, is unpredictable water access, which is tremendously problematic because increasingly it's the unpredictability of climate, or it's the unpredictability of the conditions that climate change brings that is sort of characterizing changes in these communities much more than kind of absolute disappearance of water and various other things. And this is sort of most jarringly brought home in parts of Africa's Sahel region, where you have farmers and animal herders who have been duking it out with ever greater regularity as resource access wavers. But as I found in my many discussions with members of both of these communities, if they can anticipate water shortages, then that is much less likely to lead to some kind of conflict. It may well lead to some sort of intense poverty. It might well lead to all sorts of kind of immiseration, but it's much less likely to kind of pitch them in violent ways against their adversaries. But what they cannot do is quite frequently avoid violence when they must make plans on the fly with insufficient knowledge, and at the same time as their counterparts are also kind of making kind of plans in these sort of hurried, often understandably not super well thought through ways. I spent a fascinating but extremely dust-covered 5 days sort of following this particular herd of cattle across a large swathe of Burkina Faso in about 2019. In this instance too, the very fact that conditions are changing in ways that even these kind of extremely seasoned herders cannot predict is ensuring that they're kind of often straying into areas where they simply don't know the local people. They're straying into areas where the social mores are perhaps extremely different and in areas where perhaps there's no language in common. And again, perhaps predictably, little good comes from that kind of outcome. Now, one of the things you'll notice in discussions of climate-related violence is that a lot of the kind of hot topics of the day crop up here as much as they do in other fields. And when it comes to misinformation and disinformation, it is as unpleasantly present here as it is in an increasing number of other walks of life and other subjects. And that's because whether it's kind of willfully spread or not, kind of fake news or misinterpretations over the kind of actions of fellow individuals, fellow communities, fellow nation states increasingly characterize large parts of the discourse. And I'm going to kind of provide two examples, both a kind of low level and a kind of more macro level one. And so I found in southern Iraq, a kind of rumor gained ground in a particular village along the Euphrates River that their kind of upstream peers were abusing a kind of disproportionate share of the water, thereby leaving them kind of high and dry and their kind of fields extra parched. And at a time of kind of high sectarianism, the very fact that their upstream peer was of a different sect and hence of a community that they were already inclined to believe the worst of, meant that they were also extra uninclined to actually visit the community themselves to kind of validate and in this instance actually refute whether that was true or not. And on a kind of more macro level, this is a kind of Egyptian soldier standing astride the Aswan High Dam in the south of Egypt. And as some of you might remember, particularly in 2013 and 2014, Egypt and Ethiopia became sort of mightily close to a clash that was sort of centered on Ethiopia's construction of this mega dam far upstream from Egypt in the Ethiopian highlands. But during this period, and this is a dispute that may well kind of rear its ugly head again at some point, not that far down the line. During this period, I was interviewing a lot of senior Egyptian and a number of senior Ethiopian policymakers, many of whom would terrify the heck out of me by kind of spouting conspiratorial nonsense about the motivations or what they perceive to be the rationale underlying the actions of their peers. And in this world where, misinformation and disinformation is proliferating at a speed that many of us are totally uncertain how to stifle, this is a particular space where little good can come of that development. Another, I can't really remember which of these photos is meant to sort of act as little prompts for the various points I'd like to make. Here. So one of the things that characterizes so many of the places that are kind of reeling from climate-related violence is that almost all of them are already struggling with varying degrees of non-climate-related environmental problems. And by that I mean things like air pollution, water pollution, infrastructural neglect, groundwater depletion, just to name a few. And there's that old line, I think it's an Arab proverb, that kind of even a mosquito can make a lion's eye bleed. The idea being that for a community that's sort of already kind of up to its eyeballs with kind of environmental troubles of a different nature, even a kind of smallish climate stress can be sufficient to, again, break that kind of proverbial straw. And just to try and illustrate that, these two kind of friendly-looking fellows were Iraqi forest rangers who I accompanied as they did their rounds along a part of the Iraqi-Iranian border a number of years back. And among their principal duties, they were charged with kind of reining in prolific tree cutting, prolific illegal deforestation. And despite the fact that Iraq is a country that's theoretically awash with gasoline, they were granted such a small fuel allowance, often as little as 20 litres a week, that they had to do the vast majority of their patrolling on foot. And there were a number of instances in the days when I accompanied them when we could hear the kind of telltale whine of a chainsaw from the adjacent valley. But by the time we got anywhere close, these folks with their lookout systems had long since made themselves scarce. So you've got prolific wildfires kind of ravaging this chunk of kind of mountainous northern Iraq. But the very fact that it's kind of up against an array of kind of supposedly more prosaic environmental troubles ensures that even a smallish wildfire is kind of claiming an outsized portion of the remaining vegetation. I'm going to make, I think, three final points before sort of turning over to a kind of hopefully plenty of questions from you and from Kelsey. And I want to kind of underline maybe one more of these kind of other drivers of instability, things like corruption, things like misinformation, that are in many instances exacerbated by climate stress. And this one is inequality, because even though there's the kind of perhaps conventional wisdom that kind of poor people in plenty of contexts are kind of extra drawn to violence, there's not necessarily very much evidence to support that. But what we do know is that intensification of inequalities in areas already struggling with like insufficient economic development and in some instances falling living standards very much does quite often equate to sort of dangerous degrees of resentment. And as I briefly alluded to, between about 2014 and 2017, I spent many, many months in rural parts of Iraq and Syria exploring how ISIS had profited from collapsing agricultural conditions to bolster its ranks. Now, again, a quick disclaimer, I'm not for one moment, nor is anybody else, suggesting that ISIS was a kind of wholly climate-fueled beast. What we are saying is that without climate and environmental stresses, it never would have managed to kind of pad its ranks with as many fighters as it eventually did. And one of the findings that struck me as most surprising was that some of the villages that yielded the greatest number of fighters were the villages on the periphery of Mosul in the north of Iraq, the largest city that fell under ISIS control. And that was striking because those villages were by no means the poorest of the poor. In some instances, they had amenities like refrigerators and even AC units that their kind of more geographically isolated peers could only dream of. But what they did have was a proximity to the city, and hence an awareness that as their own livelihoods, almost all of which were wrapped up with farming and animal herding, as their own livelihoods were deteriorating in lockstep with the drought and the worsening climate conditions, the livelihoods of their peers in nearby Mosul were stagnating or in some instances even improving. And so the very fact that the kind of already yawning gulf between their rural fortunes and those of the urbanites was only widening was the sort of kind of grievance and the sort of resentment that these ISIS recruiters were kind of very unfortunately and very expertly well practiced in harnessing. And very unfortunately, this is a phenomenon that in various ways, shapes and forms is playing out across the world, because as climate stresses intensify, it's the relative affluent, the kind of those who are slightly better off, particularly within villages and in some urban neighborhoods, who are significantly better placed to adapt. Am I going to gloss over that point? Okay, I mean, so one point is this book and the kind of field of climate violence in general is rather focused on the experience of poorer parts of the world. And there's very good reason for that. I mean, as sort of you very correctly and very kindly pointed out, most of this is, that ugly marriage of climate stress and poor qualities of governance. And both of those are, for the most part, and in the most severe manifestations, largely found in poorer corners of the planet. But as our own climatic conditions in richer parts of the world increasingly come to resemble those of our poorer peers, and as, in plenty of instances, our own qualities of governance, to put it lightly, kind of waver rather badly, we too are starting to see variations of climate-related violence playing out at home. Now, I live in Greece. This is a wildfire on the island of Evia, not massively far from where I live in central Athens, one of the many wildfires that have kind of turned our summers into sort of literal and metaphorical minefields in recent years. And the reason I illustrate this is that Greece is one of many, many countries where climate-related instability is beginning to manifest itself in quite a few different ways. And I'll provide a kind of tragic and sort of, in some ways, less serious, sort of less tragic, but nevertheless no less important example to support this. One of which is that we have an increasing body of evidence showing that kind of violence against women surges possibly up to 300% between the months of June and September. Now, there's a number of reasons for that are likely not related to the climate alone. Kids are not in school in the summer, which is often a stressor in many families. There can be greater financial pressure among those dependent upon seasonal labor. In one kind of finding, which I find fascinating, sort of as fascinating as I do bleak, in some instances, sort of violence against women in the summer months is not necessarily more common. It's just sort of more audible and more visible because windows are more likely to be open. But in the case of the sort of 100 to 120 women that two Greek anthropologist colleagues and I have interviewed, in the vast majority of cases, a kind of heat component has been at the absolute heart of the experiences that they and many of their peers have had. And this is kind of one of the kind of curiously evidence-free parts of the climate space. It's the ways in which extreme heat appears to be kind of leading to all sorts of physiological changes in the brain, which in turn bleed into kind of greater degrees of aggression. But equally, and this is something that sounds sort of kind of almost pedestrian and meek by comparison, but Greece is also one of a number of countries that is across the sort of Mediterranean periphery that has experienced an absolute boom in olive oil theft in recent years. And that's because as, I see, and our Spanish colleague kind of nodding rather sadly in the front, as drought across the kind of Mediterranean littoral intensifies, prices of olive oil have absolutely gone through the roof. And this has incentivized a very wide range of criminals, from opportunistic thieves to kind of criminal outfits, to steal olives and olive oils and in ways they never previously did, because such is the price this commodity commands that it's just sort of worth their while to break the law in those instances. Yeah, I mean, plenty more to be said. I mean, we're here in Houston. Houston is one of a number of cities that in the aftermath of recent hurricanes has also experienced pretty huge surges in calls to women's shelters. This happened in North Carolina in September following Hurricane Helene. So it's a kind of totally bleak but extremely global phenomenon, which very much encompasses an array of Western countries too. And I'm going to, perhaps before we kind of get back to some of the rather unhappy components of this part of the climate discourse, going to give you kind of one moderately optimistic thought to grab onto before we maybe go back in different trajectories. And that's the fact that while so much of this is grim in the extreme, and while we are on a rather unsavory trajectory, to put it euphemistically, one of the things that struck me is that in the decade and a bit in which I've been doing this kind of work, it's rather incredible that there's not more violence than there actually is, particularly when one considers how much officialdom and often circumstances are thrusting people against one another. And there's this kind of idea sometimes that there's only this kind of thin veneer of civilization sort of separating us from a kind of Lord of the Flies-esque war of all against all. But the reality is that the vast majority of people don't want to fight, and that if they're granted the tools and the mechanisms to prevent violence, most of them will kind of seize upon them. And just one little way of kind of illustrating that, to take you back one moment to the Sahel with the kind of billowing cloud of dust following the roving cattle. It's rather incredible the success that kind of a number of sort of pretty shoestring, low budget initiatives have had in reining in this intensifying violence between farmers and herders. In quite a few instances, local or international NGOs have kind of stepped in and have built kind of arbitration mechanisms. They've built mediation mechanisms to kind of bring these farmers and herders together and have them kind of hash out their differences in a peaceful setting. And a lot of the time, farmers and herders want to build these mechanisms in their own right, but such is the loss of trust between them that they're kind of incapable at some kind of point of engineering this kind of maneuver themselves. So there's so much to be done, and in an era in which humanitarian funding, even before cuts in the last few weeks kicked in, is at a premium. The good news is here you can get a pretty extraordinary bang for your buck in quite a few instances. Anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I think this should be on. My name is Kelsey Norman. I'm a fellow here at the Center for the Middle East at the Baker Institute, and I direct a program on women's rights, human rights, and refugees. Thank you so much, Peter, for being here with us tonight. It's such a pleasure to host you to talk about this subject. Thank you also to the Sustainability Institute for co-sponsoring this event with us. So if you haven't had a chance to read Peter's book yet, it's going to be available outside once we're done with this talk, and Peter, I believe, will be willing to sign some copies of you if you purchase one. So if you're of interest and you want to hear more, that's going to be available. So I'm just going to ask Peter a few questions that I had as I read through the book, and I hope it'll just give a further opportunity to discuss some of the incredible array of examples that he covers. I mean, this is based on a decade more of reporting from so many different areas of the world. So I'll do that, and then we'll open it up for questions from all of you in just a few minutes. So to start us off, Peter, one aspect of your book that I found fascinating was the different levels of analysis that you draw on. So everything from personal anecdotes, which we heard some of in the presentation, stories of local and national authorities, as well as how climate change is impacting international relations and the potential for cross-border conflict. So can you explain why you thought it was important to present these micro but also macro level perspectives in order to make your argument?
Absolutely. I mean, I guess the idea is to show that, like, increasingly few people are kind of immune to this form of violence. Now, I talk a lot in the book, and I talked a little bit here about things like ISIS, the kind of the forms of intense violence with tremendous global geopolitical ramifications that all of you will be acutely aware of. But for the vast majority of people, the violence that climate change is contributing to is much more local, much more low level, but ultimately no less punishing for them, just because it's not necessarily bleeding into kind of the sorts of things that kind of make it to the front pages of newspapers. I'll try and sort of flesh that a little bit with the second chapter of my book is centered on piracy in Bangladesh. And this is a kind of form of violence that I stumbled upon totally by accident. I was on a completely unrelated assignment for National Geographic in the kind of coastal waterways of Bangladesh about a decade ago. And while interviewing these villagers, they kind of mentioned the kind of fear in which they lived from kidnappings at the hands of pirates. And kind of the more I talked and the more I went back over the subsequent years, the more I came to understand that how much of a kind of climate component there is here, but one that has tremendous local ramifications, but increasingly global ones as well. So the local ramification is that as sea levels in the area rise, along with a whole bunch of other complications, increasing numbers of the area farmers are moving into fishing, which is in turn taking them into these kind of long-time pirate-infested waterways. And the more the volume of like available lucre, kind of possible hostage pickings increases, the more that these kind of pirates are incentivized to kind of risk the actions of the security forces and to kind of manage the rather unpleasant, disease-ridden, crocodile-infested areas because the money is simply worth it. But as the kind of pirate problem worsened, it was contributing to ever greater degrees of migration from this area to both nearby smaller cities and to Dhaka, the massive metropolis and the country's capital. And it, as far as I could see from some of my discussions with security services folks there, it was the very fact that migration was picking up to that extent that finally persuaded them to act, because they're kind of wary of the extent to which the city is sort of swelling. So it's just really trying to show kind of the many different ways, shapes, and forms this kind of violence takes.
Excellent. And on that point, related to a second question I had actually, so an increased interest for us at the Institute has been about the relationship between migration and climate change and conflict. And Peter actually participated in one of our series, our workshop series on this topic, so that's how we got to know you in the first place. But migration does play a part in I think all of your chapters, but it's sort of a sub-theme. And so I wondered if you could extrapolate a bit on the role that displacement and migration plays in terms of this relationship that you're elucidating between conflict or climate change and conflict.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, migration in some way, shape, or form crops up in every one of these chapters, as you said, and without actually meaning to, I've perhaps almost inadvertently written a book about migration. And that's because migration is almost always the classic coping mechanism that people in these kinds of situations turn to. And as you would know significantly better than me, and as many of you likely know, the vast majority of migrants, whether they're leaving for climate-related reasons or others, stay within their own countries. The number that kind of come over the Mediterranean to Europe or flow over the southern border of the US are a tiny, tiny percentage of those that are kind of gravitating towards cities and other places within their own nation states. But the trouble is that when you get migration on the scale that we increasingly are, like when you have migration that's happening to the extent that it currently is because rural economies are collapsing amid farming struggles, well, these kind of often underfunded countries with cities that are kind of already struggling to provide for the needs of existing inhabitants, let alone those of the new arrivals, unsurprisingly don't take to this particularly well. And so there have been quite a few instances where I've kind of stumbled upon various forms of kind of localized violence that are kind of knock-on consequence of various forms of migration within these countries. One of which is that in cities like Baghdad, cities like Kathmandu, I've stumbled on fights on construction sites between the kind of existing cohort of day laborers and some of the new arrivals from the countryside. And that's because most of these migrants are coming to the cities lacking many of the skills kind of useful in an urban workplace, and they're consequently drawn towards day labor. And unsurprisingly, the long-standing construction workers don't much like the fact that they've got this new intense competition, and they particularly don't like it when local construction bosses will kind of take advantage of that surplus labor to depress wages, cue bad things in some instances. And one final example, I mean, a lot of the time when we think about migration, we think about, the impact on the receiving communities, and we think about the kind of fortunes and plights of the migrants themselves. And sometimes lost in that conversation is what becomes of the communities that people leave behind. A lot of these villages lose the critical mass of residents that they need to support small businesses. And critically, a lot of them lose their best and brightest first. We know that migration always requires tremendous boldness. And it's the leading lights, the wise old heads, the particularly smart crop who are extra drawn to leaving first and then leaving in greatest numbers. And a lot of the time that leaves a kind of a space. It leaves a kind of a space in which the ne'er-doers, to put it in kind of basic simplistic terms, are given more of a free rein and are more inclined to kind of follow their own instincts in pursuing various forms of crime and things like that.
And I remember, not to put words in your mouth, I remember from a presentation you gave last year that it even had impacts on gender relations, for example, in communities where lots of men were leaving, for example, and women were often the ones left behind. So all sorts of ramifications.
Totally. I mean, and as in that case, not all of the ramifications are bad. I mean, there are quite a few villages, particularly in South Asia, but also further afield, where women have been able to step into kind of more leadership roles because so many of the men have left for kind of seasonal or more long-term migration. But in many instances, unfortunately, the bad outweighs the good.
Something that struck me reading through the book was just how many regions of the world you're drawing on. So I mean, Southeast Asia, East and West Africa, Middle East and North Africa, Europe even. Mm-hmm. And I know one of your arguments is that climate change doesn't adhere to borders. It's going to affect us all, maybe in different ways. But are there many important similarities or differences between all these regions that you look at? Are we expecting sort of blanket phenomena, or did you come across important differences?
So the first thing, the world is not experiencing climate in an equal fashion. Part of that's because certain parts of the world are simply warming faster than others. Europe, for example, is the fastest warming continent, with areas of cities like Milan and Madrid warming up to 2.5 times that of the global average. Equally, of course, places that are already experiencing kind of pretty inhospitable conditions to begin with are extra poorly placed to deal with even small increases. But I mean, think of climate as basically applying tremendous pressure to whatever a society or a place's existing weaknesses are. So if you have a place that's already pretty water impoverished, well, for the most part, it will make that place even less well water resourced than it already is. If on the flip side of that, you've got a place like, for example, Bangladesh many years that's already dealing with titanic quantities of water, in many instances it's dealing with even greater flows with the tremendous unfortunate consequences that come with that. But as kind of, I hope, comes clear to those of you that have read the book, or kind of on my publisher's encouragement, I'm sort of meant to be kind of flogging it shamelessly at every available moment. You'll see that, governance is at the heart of this, but it becomes a kind of rather grim cyclical trap, because a lot of the time a state's capacity to govern well is undermined by climate change. If you are, for example, the Pakistani government looking to respond to those devastating mega floods in 2023, your capacity to do so has often been damaged, for example, in that instance, by those floods washing away the very roads and bridges that you need to get aid and assistance to the relevant people. It's much easier said than done.
Yeah, it's clear from reading the book that governance is a central component of the ability to deal with any of these impacts and the propensity for violence. I think just one more question. So when venturing out to write this book, or sort of collecting these various sources of reporting over the years, what did you hope that people would gain from this book, and who was your target audience? Was it more a general audience that you want to be better informed about the relationship between climate change and conflict? Was it more policymakers who you think aren't making this this connection directly enough? What was your hope?
Yeah, just have my name emblazoned on massive letters on a book. A few different goals, one of which was that I feel, and still feel, that for many people in the environment and climate community, that climate-related violence is seen as kind of more of a hypothetical future threat rather than something that is already a fixture of tens, if not hundreds of millions of people's lives. Equally, even within the kind of the climate security world that I mostly work in, I think there's still a kind of slightly insufficient understanding as to quite how climate change contributes to violence. It's kind of, you get kind of climate stress X, and then some kind of weird magic potion happens, and then bout of violence Y comes out the other end. So by kind of writing a book looking to kind of articulate the process, I've hoped to sort of try and help fill that gap. But it's also just really trying to kind of hammer home that this is a form of violence that is ever more coming for us, and is very much coming for us in a kind of business as usual warming scenario. I mean, just to kind of spell out a little bit more the direct consequences in this country. I mean, there's a reason why the Department of Defense, US military, has been so keen to work on climate change for the last 25 years. And that's because from the early to mid 90s onwards, they were acutely aware of how much US military infrastructure is vulnerable to climate stresses. I mean, even in 2018, there was a DoD study showing that 50% of all US military bases have been in some way damaged or affected by climate and environmental phenomena. We have an average of 3,000 to 4,000 US troops that are getting heat stroke and heat exhaustion on an annual basis, which is more than double what it was in the late 1990s. We have National Guardsmen who are ever more being pulled away from their core duties to respond to wildfires, for example. In 2023, forget the exact statistic, US National Guardsmen had to dedicate 10 times more days to combating wildfires than they had even 3 or 4 years previously. Equally, I mean, Norfolk, Virginia, the world's largest naval installation, like up to a third of its piers are underwater for a good chunk of the year. So the very fact that, just using this as additional illustrations, the very fact that kind of combat readiness, base infrastructure, capacity to perform core duties is being undermined at every turn is just an illustration in miniature of what wider society, wider parts of the economy are destined to experience barring meaningful action. And so the hope is that by spelling this out in a book that is very much meant for the casual reader, a book that assumes no particular background knowledge and is written in what I hope is a kind of compelling, very accessible manner to sort of try and bring that home to a much broader audience than this field has previously enjoyed.
It is very compelling. I can attest to that. We'll open it up for questions now. So I think we're going to have mics come around, or the room is mic'd. Okay, please go ahead.
First, welcome to Rice and welcome to Houston.
Thank you.
A few years ago, I read that because of several years of drought and water stress, the events of 2011 for the Arab Awakening, Arab Spring, overcame what otherwise were sectarian differences in Syria specifically, so that everybody was cranky, and also perhaps made them more susceptible to being sympathetic later on with Daesh, ISIS, or Al-Qaeda. Is that a pattern that you've seen elsewhere, and we just say, oh, these things happen, without really putting that component into a contributory cause? Thank you.
No, thank you. And I'm extremely excited to be in Houston as part of my first trip to Texas. And thank you all for your hospitality. So yeah, the kind of the food role in the Arab Spring is a complicated one. I mean, the classic narrative, and there's probably an element of truth to it, is that so back in 2007, 2008, the world was hit with a bit of a perfect food storm. We had a big increase in oil prices. We had crop failures in a number of major food exporters. and a number of other things that collectively pushed up prices in ways that major food importers, like Egypt, were extremely poorly placed to handle. And this was a kind of phenomenon that had a very long lag. And so it's certainly true that in the year or two leading up to the Egyptian revolution in early 2011, that food prices had risen. The country which kind of provides, for an array of complicated reasons, a number of heavily subsidized foodstuffs like bread, was trying rather hard to kind of rein in some of those subsidies in order to kind of balance its books and kind of better account for the greater amounts of money they were having to spend on kind of wheat imports. And yeah, there is a reason why when Egyptian protesters were gathering in Tahrir Square in early 2011, they were shouting for bread, freedom, and social justice. Yeah, I mean, it's one of these areas where the narrative gets a little bit muddied and has been simplified in places. But to speak to the broader point, I mean, it's the old line of kind of all countries being 3 days away from revolution. Like, you cut off the electricity, you cut off the water, you raise food prices, pandemonium would ensue in much less time than any of us would have possibly imagined. And that's not a kind of comforting thought at the moment, because at a time when harvest failures in major food exporters appear to be becoming more common, at the same time as tariffs and an array of other things are becoming a little bit more of a feature of the geographic landscape, this kind of risks giving rise to the kinds of contagion that in food markets that so many countries are not well placed to handle, including a number of rich ones. I mean, countries like Japan, countries like the UK depend on food imports for more than 50% of all calories consumed. Yeah, it's a real watch this space.
Thanks for all your thoughts. And just to pick up on that last point about, this could happen anywhere at any time. Is any of the work that you've done in develop any kind of a predictive, you can call it a model, but predictive something that you could, something that leaders could use for governance, for looking at like a predictive model for predicting when the next situation might develop, where you get violence from some of these outcomes?
So there's an operation in a Dutch outfit called the Water, Peace and Security Group that is trying to devise just that. I think many others are quite skeptical of its chances of success, precisely because, I mean, as I hope I've begun to illustrate, like, it's really messy how like climate fits into all of this. Like, ultimately, you often need, certainly from a researching perspective, to kind of see how climate is interacting with everything else that's going on in an individual's life, a community's existence, to determine how vulnerable or not it is to climate. So it's likely, like, no kind of data could be quite granular enough to sort of make that kind of call. That said, I mean, of course, we have, or maybe more appropriately, we had an extremely effective device for determining when famine was about to break out. It's USAID's FuseNet system, which has saved almost certainly hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lives over the course of the last few years, precisely because of the brilliance with which it assessed rainfall patterns, extreme heat waves, and matched that against conflict and kind of poor qualities of governance in many of the countries most exposed to famine. That has temporarily at least been shut down in the last few weeks. So these tools can play a form of kind of, they can play their part in it, but there's a limit to their utility in a violent setting, at least.
I think up there first, and then we'll come back to you, sir.
Going off of that point, I'm curious as to, in your research, what types of international relation conflict management strategies you came across that do speak to the nuanced role that climate does play in fueling violence.
So on the kind of global stage, climate security is still kind of in its infancy. And that's partly because despite efforts from a range of, I mean, the US in the past, at least, Europe, and actually a lot of countries across sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere to kind of push climate security up the global peace and security agenda, the likes of the Russians, the Chinese, and the Indians have forever blocked those resolutions at the UN Security Council for a complicated array of reasons. I mean, even within kind of our own countries, I say this is a sort of half American, half Brit. I mean, the European Parliament in January 2022 was about to debate and likely would have passed a resolution on better incorporating climate security programming into the European Union's strategy. And then a month later, along came the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and all things climate security just got relegated from the agenda. Equally in this country, in the first sort of year or two of the previous administration, there was a lot of work going on in the climate security space. But of course, I mean, attention is an extremely finite commodity. And between Ukraine and Gaza, like climate security also struggled to kind of get a look in various security circles. And in this kind of extra polarized world in which we currently live, I'm not particularly optimistic that we'll be able to push climate security back up the agenda, certainly at the UN, in a way that we might have a few years ago.
Go ahead, please.
Peter, thanks for being here and welcome to Houston. What do you think the individuals that you interviewed and lived with and traveled with, if they read your book, how would they feel about the points that you're making? I think that one of the things that I find in my travels, especially in the poorer parts of the world, more undeveloped parts of the world, they don't necessarily connect the climate crisis with what's going on in their life, and until they do, until we all do, until the masses do, how does it end up in political change and true political acceptance? So just somebody that's living and breathing this, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, on the one hand, as you've perhaps found, like even if people can't articulate it in scientific terms, there's an extremely broad awareness, as you've likely found in your own work across the poor parts of the world, that something's not right. Like there's, even if it hasn't got the kind of scientific terms attached to it, an understanding that like climate change is kind of ripping through their communities and like inflicting unprecedented degrees of difficulty is near sort of broadly understood. I mean, overt climate change denialism is at this point basically a uniquely US phenomenon. That said, you're right, of course, in that precisely because people have so much else going on in their lives, a lot of the time it becomes almost a case of the frog in the kind of cauldron of boiling water, whereby things are getting that little bit worse and that little bit worse and that little bit worse over an extended period, to such a point that many of them struggle, very understandably, to disentangle climate and environmental troubles from the messy morass of everything else that's going on and going wrong within their lives. And we were talking a little bit earlier about just the migration component, so earlier in the day about climate-related migration. And a lot of the time when you ask someone who has moved, for example, from a village in rural Iraq to Baghdad, why did you move? They won't come out first with the water and climate and environment component. They'll say, I moved because I couldn't make a living in the countryside. Why couldn't you make a living? Well, because my crop yields were down. Why were your crop yields down? Because water access has fallen tremendously. Anyway, I mean, I've tried, and up to you as to whether I've pulled it off, but tried to kind of approach it with as much humility as I can. I mean, ultimately, when you're working in places that you might know well, but that ultimately you're not from, there's going to be a limit to quite how much you can grasp. And as a consequence, there are places where I would have wanted maybe to make slightly more ambitious, slightly more grandiose claims, but where I felt that maybe my degree of understanding wasn't quite sufficient to pull it off. And so I've reined that in.
Great question, great answer. Others? Yes, sir.
Hi, Peter. I'm struck by how globally there's a big business in, mostly by large corporations, areas like water use monitoring, water conservation, water recycling, all the way to desalination. Is your view that those technologies are great if you have a lot of money to spend, like a place like the United Arab Emirates, which is basically in constant drought? Or do you see some of these technologies potentially making a difference in drought-stricken areas in, say, middle-income type countries?
Yeah, thank you. So the short answer, if you look at the kind of countries of the world that are most climate vulnerable, and you look at the countries of the world that are most climate affected, I mean, that Venn diagram is basically a perfect circle. We're talking about the Afghanistans, the Malis, the Yemens, and so-and-sos of the world. And so the places that are most desperately in need of assistance are the places that have such low levels of governance and such high levels of insecurity and existing violence for a whole array of reasons that even getting in any kind of solutions is extremely difficult. And we have, as a kind of international community, we've kind of compounded that difficulty through an unwillingness to kind of risk, I don't know, the loss of bits of assistance to corruption or whatever else, which, okay, I mean, there's understandable reasons there, but ultimately we need to display slightly less cowardice and slightly more imagination. But no, you're right that in a lot of these kind of middle-income countries, many of which, precisely for this reason, have displayed much greater ability to prevent their climate stresses from pouring into violence, that technology can help. I mean, I'm one of many people who are perhaps excessively suspicious of like the utility of technology in these settings, precisely because, take desalination, nobody, even with kind of recent technological advances, has managed to make desalination anywhere near cheap enough for it to be used in the context in which it's most badly required. I mean, in almost no context, aside from maybe some cash crops grown in greenhouses here or there, can desalinated water be made cheap enough for use in farming. So it can certainly help on the margins, but in the places that are most vulnerable to this kind of violence, the barriers to entry are just frankly enormous, and there's just no compensation for the nitty-gritty, profoundly unsexy work that comes with, I don't know, better conservation tactics, rebuilding infrastructure in such a way as to make it less wasteful, and things like that are not exactly vote-winning maneuvers, but that are nevertheless the things that generally need to be done.
Yeah, the institutional front, I see your point.
There was a hand over here, I think, yeah.
Certainly, climate is one serious problem. But you know, we have a climate problem because we had 8 times as many people as the world can sustain. Now, the only real solution is to have fewer people, which nobody ever seems to want to address. We can wait and have a world war and lower the population, or the whole world starve to death. But you know, there are peaceful ways you can get a smaller population at much greater cost, it seems to me. Why do we never talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, you're right that it's relevant, and you're also right that it's a highly contentious topic within environmental circles, and I guess that's because the answer sort of falls on both sides of the coin. On the one hand, the parts of the world that are growing particularly swiftly, notably sub-Saharan Africa, I mean, the average person in sub-Saharan Africa uses something like 1/30th or 1/40th of the resources of the average American, average Australian, average Canadian. So ultimately, the kind of tremendous growth in the world is not really happening in ways that is like bleeding into like massive increases in emissions or things like that. That said, population growth, high levels of population growth are indeed contributing to, I don't know, the greater complexity within a lot of these countries. When you already have as you're kind of making clear, when you already have kind of inopportune person to resource matches, the very fact that demand is surging certainly reduces a community's room for maneuver, it reduces its wiggle room. A lot of the time, for example, a village that is struggling with low crop yields will kind of expand agricultural land into a forest, chopping down lots of trees in order to have kind of more space for crop cultivation and perhaps more building materials, and thereby, of course, just fuel many of the problems that they were reeling from in the first place. It's a difficult conversation, again, partly because for as long as we in the richer parts of the world, and this is absolutely not just a uniquely American problem, but for as long as we in the richer parts of the world continue to consume such a vastly disproportionate share of our resources, it gets quite hard to sort of center our focus on other parts of the world. One final point, though, is, I mean, it's the big trouble in a way is that and actually the big contributor to emissions in a lot of places is the growth of the middle class in countries like China and India. And that's because as these places become that bit more prosperous, many of them, of course, want to live variations of the kinds of lives that we live. They want air conditioning in places that are pretty broilingly hot to begin with. They want to eat more meat. They want to eat things like nuts. But again, I mean, for as long as we are consuming titanic kind of shares of meat and things like that, it's really hard, if not impossible, for us to kind of rail against that. But you're right, the population bit is important.
In fact, in National Geographic, 10 or 15 years ago, there was an interesting article pointing out that, in fact, the Earth can only sustain about 2 billion people. And now we have 8.
Yeah.
But in fact, if the third world lived at the same level as the first world, it would be like having 80 billion people.
Yeah.
So at some point,
Yeah,
we
yeah.
need to address the problem of too many people,
It is.
because it's the only real solution.
Is there another question? Yeah, ma'am, please.
Thank you, sir, for coming and speaking with us. I was wondering, as we see problems, you might say, in the southern part of the world, you've got tremendous migration from the south into the United States and from the west or east of Europe and south of Europe toward Europe, which leads to problems with conflict, with violence, with governments. Do you see any mechanisms, understanding that this migration will continue as conditions worsen in the south, that we could start now mitigating eventual violence and eventual problems to make our world somehow more peaceful?
Yeah, I mean that's sort of the core goal of a lot of the foreign aid that the US and European and other countries have been distributing over the years. I mean, maybe there's an altruistic component to some of it, but above all, it's grounded in self-interest. It's a pursuit of an array of policies. And in fact, a lot of the USAID-directed programming in Central America was specifically designed to kind of improve the lives of people in such a way as to make them less likely to migrate. I mean, we know that a lot of the migrants in Central America who come from the Pacific coast are fleeing really fast intensifying drought in the highlands there, which has just rendered agriculture, again, the dominant kind of economic lifestyle there, effectively unviable. And so in cutting back foreign assistance in a way that, I mean, in addition to the US, many European governments are doing, is it's classic self-sabotage. I mean, as large as many of the migration movements into Europe and into the US undoubtedly have been in recent years, there's a very strong case that they probably would have been many times larger without some of the initiatives that we've had over the years.
We have time maybe for one more question if there is one.
I have one.
Yes, go ahead, please.
Because it's a funny one. Do you see the United States looking for another shipping passage in the Arctic and talking about taking over Greenland as, you know, then it will be Russia and us against Europe as a climate violence?
Certainly. No, I mean, the Arctic, one of the many reasons why the US military got really interested in climate change from the 1990s onwards, centered on the Arctic. There's an awareness that as large parts of the Arctic Sea and possibly the Northwest Passage become ice-free for ever greater periods of the year, that it will be thawing open geographically sensitive and possibly materially rich waters in ways that the US and its allies will be required to patrol. So there's certainly a very strong kind of geostrategic component to much of this. Secondly, I mean, countries like Greenland and parts of Canada and Russia that are possibly going to be ice-free for the first time since time immemorial are undoubtedly extremely well endowed with an array of resources that, I mean, everybody from the US onwards is particularly keen to get its mitts on. It could be. I mean, given that this is kind of nation state on nation state as opposed to kind of tribe on tribe or community on community, one would hope that this is one of the many areas in which the logic of mutually assured destruction will kind of conspire against a conflict. But we're living in messy times, and it's just yet another another kind of point of potential contact. And it was the old line from the great historian Barbara Tuchman, which is that war is the unfolding of miscalculations. Like, so much of the time, the chief protagonists to conflict don't particularly want war. It just happens from like bad decision building on active misfortune. So yeah, the Arctic is dangerous as hell.
All right, I just want to say a quick number of thank yous. First, Anna Martin-Gill, our research manager at the Center for the Middle East, for organizing this event. Also our events team. I'm sorry, sir. Did you want to have one final remark? Okay.
I have really two questions to ask. One is the migration. Migration has been there throughout human history, pretty much, particularly in our lifetime, many of us. Whenever there is a conflict, war, and human beings just love to go to war. Okay. There is a migration, okay, that happened after the Second World War, went to Korean War, went to Vietnam War, we went to Middle East Iraq War, now we have a new theater, Ukraine War. So it will keep on going, and migration has always been there, okay? So it's not just climate alone, that's what I'm trying to tell you. That migration has always been there, and whenever you have a migration, when the people try to go to safe place, people already settled, yes, they have come to steal things from us. Be careful.
Well, sir, I think this is exactly the type of phenomena that Peter does address in the book.
Second question, the one is, you said foreign assistance. A little more declining.
Absolutely.
The foreign assistance you were talking about.
Certainly. Thank you. I mean, I'll try and keep it very brief because I know we're out of time. No, I mean, I'm to be clear that the forms of migration that I discuss, much like the forms of violence, are never just climate. It's climate as one of many components. You're completely correct that migration in its many different forms has been a characteristic of history. But as the honourable gentleman here correctly pointed out, the sheer volume of people involved, coupled with the fact that, I mean, we're naturally invested in current problems much more than in historical ones, ensures that, and as you also pointed out, many of these historic migrations have indeed played out against a rather violent backdrop. And if we are to avoid that with these superior numbers in this complicated historical moment, well, it's incumbent on us to sort of manage it as best as possible now. As for, I mean, foreign assistance takes so many different forms, ranging from direct food assistance and medical assistance and other forms of immediate, totally life-saving first aid, through to kind of much more elaborate, long-lasting programs. For example, giving farmers in drought-afflicted areas seeds that require slightly less water, or seeds that are kind of capable of handling the tougher temperatures they're now up against. Just an array of different things across the health, education, agriculture, and beyond space that will hopefully bolster their lives in ways that make them safer and more prosperous. And, I mean, as far as many Western countries are concerned, there, not here.
I just want to make sure we have enough time for everyone to get a book if they want one, and for Peter to do the signing. So just a quick thank you to Anna, as I said, to our events team, to our AV team, and to Peter for being here with us tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Sure. So head out front if you'd like to purchase a book.